Hello, I'm James Donaldson and welcome to my research presentation, A Self-Centered Beginning, and the culmination of 2 years on the MSc Counselling at Bangor University. The presentation should last approximately 20 minutes and then there'll be opportunity for you to ask me questions in the live stream at the end. I want to begin with a quote from Aristotle. We are what we repeatedly do. Excellence then is not an act, but a habit. But is that true? That's what I wanted to hypothesize, to research, to think about. Are we really the culmination of what we do each day? Does it affect the way we think, the way we feel? Our levels of well-being, our levels of self-awareness particularly. And so I developed two hypotheses to help me test the research in this area. The first hypothesis looked at the relationship between the frequency of the habits, particularly the positive psychological habits that we practice, and our well-being and self-awareness. The second hypothesis looked at the formality of those habits and their relationship to well-being and self-awareness. And I'll speak more about that later as we move through the presentation. We're very privileged to end up with a participant number of 233 once we'd removed relevant participants from the study because they'd failed to leave a reasonable amount of data, for example, or hadn't ticked the right boxes. You know how it is. It left us with this lovely number. Most of those people were students at Bangor University, recruited through the in-house SONA system, getting their credits. But we were also able to recruit a number through Facebook and Twitter using social media links. And this meant that we got access to quite a broad age range, from 18 to 76, which was quite wonderful. It meant that we got a really good, diverse and rich level of data. What we were really looking at, as I said, was the relationship between these psychological habits, positive ones, and our well-being and self-awareness. We really wanted to see if there was a link. If we did one more, did that mean we experienced the other more? Or the opposite way around? That was really the question that we were looking to examine. So first of all, well-being. In order to test and measure for well-being, we used Butler and Kern's PERMA profiler. But what is PERMA? Well, simply put, PERMA is a positive psychological model and used really to look at the positive aspects of the way someone thinks. The term PERMA was first coined by Martin Seligman, former head of the American Psychological Association. And Martin really asked the question, how do human beings flourish? In other words, how do they do well? What he wanted was an emphasis within psychology that moved away from the old medical model in terms of the treatment of mental and physical disease towards one that looked at encouraging people to be at their best and coined this phrase PERMA. But what does it mean? So the P of PERMA stands for positive emotions and particularly the frequency of them. Simple equation, right? The more positive emotions we have in our lives, the happier we should feel. And that's what's suggested in this area particularly. But also about the closeness of these positive emotions. Like, are we capturing them? Are we getting alongside them? Are we noticing them? And Seligman sort of really wanted to explore that area particularly. Think about your day. You know, you might get in the shower in the morning, but miss it because your head's on the deadlines you've got to meet today. You might get a coffee, enjoy that first sip, but then by the 5th, 6th, 7th, it's gone because you've got 12 emails to sort out. It's about the closeness of these positive things we experience and the emotions they evoke. The E of PERMA is for engagement. So what we do, of course, what we do in our lives, but not just that, how we do it. And one of the key terms that came out of this particular area of the research was that of flow, first coined by Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi. This idea of being in this total state, this absorbed way of being in whatever we're doing, whether it's work, whether it's something creative, whether it's a hobby or a pastime that we do in our own time. But this idea of being totally connected to it, neither negative nor positive, particularly in emotion, just there and wholly there. The R for relationships. Obviously, those normal relationships with other people in our lives and how they impact upon us, but also the relationship with self, the relationship with the me, myself and I, and with our world and the environment that we move around in, to give it a broader understanding. The M of PERMA is for meaning. Really, when looking at meaning, what is being inferred to there is that thing we do that is beyond or bigger than ourselves, that bigger purpose. For us as psychotherapists and counsellors, our role really could be chock full of meaning, that help and support of others, offering service, that purposeful element. The A of PERMA is about accomplishments, the what we do and what we achieve in our lives, and also about our strength, the resources that we learn along the way that then let us plan ahead and realise that we've got in our locker to plan for further success moving forward. In order to offer greater balance within the PERMA profile and the measurement of well-being, there were these included aspects of health, loneliness, which of course even those of us who live in the busiest of places can still feel, and general well-being aspects as well, to give it a nice rounded, balanced and richer way of measuring well-being. Moving to self-awareness then, and to measure self-awareness we used the self-awareness outcome questionnaire by sy'n. Again, this breaks down into component parts. The first being this concept of reflective self-development. Our internal check, but also the way in which we relate to our external world, the relationship between how we think and conceptualize our world inside of ourselves. An emotional quotient too, this concept of emotional intelligence, being able to understand what emotion we're feeling and how that affects other people, and also understanding the emotions in others and how that affects us. Also, the concept of ourself in terms of what we do, how we go about in the world, doing the things we do. Acceptance is a key part of the questionnaire, particularly situational acceptance, in other words, where we find ourselves and how we do, and also acceptance of the self. This is who I am doing what I do. Our proactivity at work, and this can be quite a broader meaning of the sense work, not necessarily paid work, but the work we do in our life each day. And it's about the capacity we have for that, the creativity behind that, the thought process involved in that. Those areas specifically were measured within the outcome questionnaire. Emotional costs too. What are the impacts of ourself and our situations and our work in our world? And considering how, as we go along, we invest emotionally in those things. In order to measure positive psychological habits, we hit a bit of a brick wall here in the research. This is one of the areas where we found a gap, really, that we wanted to fill with this research specifically. There are ways of measuring habits more generally, but we wanted to really look at positive psychological habits rather than, if you like, more behavioural habits generally. Now, I know I've quoted a reference here for Faye, Effie and I, okay? We've not quite made it that far yet. We didn't make it into a journal at this point, but, you know, I'm aiming high, and let's face it, people deserve the acknowledgement, okay? So yeah, just to reiterate that point, measuring these types of habits specifically is limited in the research. What we designed, therefore, was a tool that really looked at measuring both physical and emotional quotients of our habits, what we do, what we think, what we feel as we go along practicing the things that we practice. We also designed a two-part questionnaire that aligned with our hypothesis. The first part really measured frequency. So the answers therefore ranged from never to constantly when participants were responding to each question. The second part really looked at the formality. So how were participants undertaking their habits? Were they guided? Were they scheduled? Were they spontaneous? And that's really what we were looking for. So what about the findings? Let's have a quick run through, and then later on we'll discuss the implications behind them. So first of all, there was no significant relationship at all between positive psychological habits and their frequency and well-being. There just wasn't one there. However, when it came to positive psychological habit frequency and self-awareness, there was a very significant relationship, 0.01. And it was a positive relationship, meaning that when habit frequency rose, so too did self-awareness. When habit frequency decreased, so too did self-awareness. There was a mirroring, which was really interesting. We'll discuss that again as we go along. Positive psychological formality, again, there was no significance whatsoever between either well-being or self-awareness. And I'm going to be honest here, we were gutted at first with this finding because we really wanted to get that kind of positive relationship, because we thought it just existed and it would kind of support the idea that what we should do is go about getting people to practice more positive things and they'll feel better in their lives. The research just didn't necessarily point to that. And there's maybe a few factors that we'll talk about as to why that didn't happen. One of the first factors really is the study limitations. Okay, no study's perfect by design, and obviously there can be certain factors such as biases or lapses or exclusions that we could rectify on a second time round. And I really wanted to look at just some of those potential impacts that might have got in the way of the study outcome. First of all is COVID-19. Now, I know we might all bang on about it quite a bit, but let's face it, the research that was undertaken here took place during some of the most severe restrictions to British society that we've seen in over 100 years. And so much so that actually there are ongoing longitudinal psychological research impact studies to really look at how psychological research specifically is being impacted by COVID as we move through time, suggesting that there obviously is impacts. That's what's being, again, hypothesized. This study, as I say, took place during lockdown restrictions. And I wanted to consider some of the potential influences that had, because it was mentioned in our data. We had a qualitative question asking for any sort of general feedback on the questionnaires. And participants mentioned COVID-19 particularly, that it had altered their way of thinking about things. They'd gone from worrying about themselves to worrying more about the world. Some people mentioned that it had limited their habitual practice, some of the things they could do before they couldn't do now. And that got us thinking about how much more of an influence could COVID have had on the whole design. Like, for example, within the Wellbeing questionnaire, one of the questions is, in general, how often do you feel anxious? Now, outside of lockdown restrictions and in a normalised society, of course people feel anxious, but they might feel anxious in a different way compared to how they feel under restrictions. Some people might feel less anxious. I know I did initially. It felt like a lovely relaxing period of sitting in the sun. But then for me, I don't know about you, but those anxieties sort of caught up as I got onto placement and couldn't talk to clients face to face, had to do it all on the phone. I missed the contact with my colleagues on the degree, with my peers, and also with my lecturers. So again, COVID-19 really has the potential to shape the way in which we answer this question. So too in the self-awareness questionnaire, one of the questions there was, I see my work life as something I have power to affect. That power might have been taken away completely from people during COVID-19 restrictions. Or perhaps people found they were very empowered to be more creative and try different ways. But again, the power to distort the answer is very, very clear. And in our habits questionnaire, I take a break from social media. People might have moved closer to social media during lockdown. It enabled them to get access to the huge amounts of information with regards to coronavirus. It helped them to connect with other people more, maybe with their families in different ways. And that might have affected things like mood, their well-being, their self-awareness in different ways. And so in short, I think it would be wise to run this study again outside of those restrictions when society had essentially normalised back to ways in which we've been practising our lives before. Another limitation was the time frame. We didn't really ask participants to consider periods of their life, say the last 3 months, 6 months, 12 months, in the way that other questionnaires do. Certainly the ones that I used on NHS placement did that over the last 2 weeks or over the last 4 weeks. You know, they would look at that sort of impact to give participants the ability to focus and to kind of be accurate about that time frame. I think on reflection, that's something I would include if I was to run this study again. The balance between quantitative and qualitative data, we were very heavily balanced towards the quantitative. Everything was measurable and numbered for the purpose of running the correlation. But what showed from the one qualitative question that we had, there was a whole richness to be gleaned from our participants. And we could have asked more, we could have gone deeper if we'd only included more qualitative data. It would have given us a greater understanding as well of this point in time that our participants were going through. So I definitely, again, if we were rerunning the study, would include more qualitative data, more questions, more open questions about their answers. So what about the implications then for counselling? Should self-awareness be a primary focus? It probably is in most therapies. That would certainly be my experience from researching them and from practicing over the career that I've had both recently and historically. But should it be more of a focus? In fact, even a starter or an entirety? One of the issues with bringing a client's raising a client's self-awareness is that there can be negative outcomes as a client becomes more clear, if you like, on the actuality of their life, on who they are in life, of what they're not able to cope with, of what they're really dealing with. So it might be that as we raise self-awareness, we get negative outcomes, particularly in the earlier stages. But should we be thinking about raising self-awareness prior to then the interventions such as positive interventions, the perma side of life, the growing of the flourishing part of our life? Should we start more carefully by raising a person's ability to become more self-aware first? And what about us as therapists and self-awareness? Is it an aspect of self-care? By becoming more self-aware, do we know better when to withdraw or when to stay alongside a client, to be able to withdraw our services even perhaps if we're under stresses and strains that are really affecting our ability to practice? Is this one of those key areas that we should really explore within supervision and ongoing therapy? It's certainly supported by the BACP and develop that concept of developing a reflective and ongoing practice as we go through our lives as therapists. What about the client? How do we help them in this sense? Perhaps we should look at the development of mindfulness-based interventions, particularly linked through the research again with the cultivation of self-awareness. One thing seems to go very well with the other. Again, this correlation and this relationship. But what about tools such also as diarising, writing letters to self, to other people? What about strengths development, becoming aware of what we've got in this locker, who we are, what we've overcome? This concept of self-awareness, really understanding who we are. This inner dialogue perhaps needs to be explored. How we've spoken to ourselves over time and the impact this has had on us and the impact this is having in our world as we migrate through it. There could be wider implications too in terms of out in the workplace. Could we as potential trainers of the future be talking about self-awareness to people there? What about education, helping young people to become aware of who they are, how they think, how their anxieties land with them, and how they might manage them more effectively? What I'd also say on this point too is that further research in this area would be an excellent place to go. We need more data, particularly with self-awareness in the modern workplace and in education, to see specifically if there could be an impact there. So that concludes my presentation. I want to thank you for listening. I quite obviously only put a dog there because, let's face it, they're very cute, everyone loves them, and it just means that they really like your presentation. Joking aside, I want to just acknowledge a few people at this point. My course tutors, thank you for the gifts you've given throughout the course. It means a great deal and really helped me, I believe, to be a better counsellor. To my study buddy, Effie, thanks for going through this journey with me. You've been a much needed friend. To my placement and personal supervisors, I offer you enormous thanks. You've given me so much. It's really appreciated. And to my cohort, to my peers, thanks a lot. You've been a great bunch of people, and it's been wonderful to get to know you. I want to finish with a quote from Stephen Covey, who said that self-awareness is our capacity to stand apart from ourselves and examine our thinking, our motives, our history, our scripts, our actions, and our habits and tendencies. Is this not then really therapy in itself? Is this not the quintessential essence of psychotherapy and counselling? Just a question for you to consider. Thanks for listening. It's been an absolute privilege, and I look forward to your very thoughtful questions.